You know that weird feeling when you've believed something for years, only to find out it wasn't true? We all love a good tale, but when you start digging into the facts, you find that history is full of stories that never actually happened. It's wild to think about how many things we've accepted as truth simply because we've heard them over and over again. Sometimes the stories are exaggerated, sometimes they're misremembered, and sometimes they're completely made up. What's even stranger is that these myths often become more popular than the real events they supposedly describe. The truth gets buried under layers of retelling, and before you know it, the legend replaces reality. So, if you're ready to challenge what you think you know about history, let's consider 14 instances where the facts just don't match up with the stories we've all heard. 1. Paul Revere didn't shout, "The British are coming." Paul Revere's midnight ride is legendary, but the details of what actually happened are a bit different from the story we learned in school. For one, Revere didn't gallop through the streets yelling, "The British are coming." That wouldn't have made sense, as many of the people in the colonies still considered themselves British. Instead, Revere likely warned people quietly to avoid attracting attention from British patrols. The reality is less dramatic, but Revere's ride was still an essential part of American history. 2. Lady Godiva didn't ride naked through town. The image of Lady Godiva riding naked through the streets to protest her husband's oppressive taxes is one of the most famous legends of medieval England. However, there's no historical evidence to support it. The story didn't appear until centuries after Lady Godiva's time, and it was likely invented or embellished by monks to add drama to her legacy. While she may have been a real person, the lore of her naked ride, probably false. 3. George Washington didn't chop down a cherry tree. The story of young George Washington confessing to cutting down his father's cherry tree with the famous line, "I cannot tell a lie," is completely made up. It was first written by Parson Weems in a biography of Washington published after his death. Weems wanted to highlight Washington's honesty, so he fabricated the story to make him seem more virtuous. Washington was undoubtedly a great leader, but the cherry tree incident is pure fiction. For Marie Antoinette didn't say, "Let them eat cake." Marie Antoinette is often blamed for saying, "Let them eat cake," when she was told that the French peasants had no bread, but there's no evidence she ever uttered those words. In fact, the phrase was first recorded years before Marie Antoinette became queen, and it was likely attributed to her later as part of revolutionary propaganda to paint her as out of touch. It's a catchy quote, but it doesn't belong to Marie Antoinette. 5. The Iron Maiden wasn't a medieval torture device. Contrary to what many people believe, the Iron Maiden, a spiked, coffin-like device, is not a real medieval torture tool. It was actually a creation of the 18th and 19th centuries, likely as part of Europe's fascination with medieval torture. There's no record of the Iron Maiden being used during the Middle Ages. It's more of a gruesome prop than a historical fact. Sometimes, what we think of as medieval history is just a later invention to support our preconceived notions about an era. 6. Salem witches weren't burned at the stake. The infamous Salem witch trials are often remembered for the image of accused witches being burned at the stake. However, no one in Salem was executed this way. Those convicted of witchcraft were hanged, not burned. The image of burning witches comes from European witch trials, where this practice was more common. Salem's history is dark enough without the added myth of burning witches. 7. Benjamin Franklin didn't discover electricity with a kite. The story of Benjamin Franklin flying a kite in a storm to discover electricity is iconic, but it's likely more symbolic than real. While Franklin did experiment with electricity, historians doubt the kite experiment happened exactly as described. It's possible that Franklin's experiments were later simplified into a dramatic narrative to make them easier to understand. Franklin's contributions to science were real, but the kite story might be a bit of a stretch. 8. The Emu War Wasn't a War. Australia's Great Emu War of 1932 sounds like an absurd battle between humans and birds, and while it did happen, calling it a war is an exaggeration. The Australian government attempted to cull emus to prevent them from damaging crops, but their efforts were largely ineffective. It was more of a failed pest control operation than an actual war. Still, the idea of a country going to war with birds is pretty entertaining. 9. Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb. While Thomas Edison is often credited with inventing the light bulb, he wasn't the first to create it. Several inventors, including Humphrey Davy and Joseph Swan, had already developed early versions of the light bulb before Edison came along. Edison's real contribution was improving the design and making it commercially viable, which is why his name is so closely associated with the invention. Edison perfected the light bulb, but he didn't invent it from scratch. 10. Catherine the Great and the Horse. One of the most salacious myths in history involves Russian Empress Catherine the Great and a horse. According to the rumor, Catherine died while attempting a sexual act with a horse, but this is completely false. The story was likely invented by her political enemies after her death to tarnish her reputation. Catherine the Great died of natural causes, and the horse story is nothing more than scandalous fiction. 11. Walt Disney didn't draw Mickey Mouse. While Walt Disney is often credited with creating Mickey Mouse, the actual drawings were done by Disney's chief animator, Iwerks. Disney came up with the idea and voiced the character, but Iwerks was the one who brought Mickey to life on paper. Disney's real genius lay in his ability to build a brand around the character, not necessarily in the actual drawing. It was his vision, but without Iwerks, Mickey might not have looked the way he does today. Disney and Iwerks were a dynamic duo, with Disney providing the creative spark and Iwerks turning it into a global icon. 12. The bloodiest gladiator fights weren't as common as you think. Thanks to movies and television, we tend to think of gladiatorial games in ancient Rome as constant, bloody battles to the death. While there were certainly violent fights, the reality is that not all gladiator matches were death matches. In fact, many gladiators were highly skilled and valuable to their trainers, and their deaths were not as common as Hollywood would have us believe. The goal was often to entertain, not necessarily to kill. Gladiators could be spared by the crowd or by the emperor if they fought well, and some even became famous athletes with devoted fan followings. 13. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, is often thought of as the moment that freed all enslaved people in the United States. However, it didn't immediately free all slaves. The proclamation only applied to states in rebellion during the Civil War, meaning it didn't affect slaves in border states that had remained loyal to the Union. It was an important step toward ending slavery, but it took the 13th Amendment in 1865 to officially abolish slavery throughout the entire country. 14. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian. Cleopatra is often thought of as the quintessential Egyptian queen, but she wasn't Egyptian at all. She was of Macedonian Greek descent and a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. Despite being born in Egypt, Cleopatra's family lineage is traced back to Greece, and she was part of a dynasty that spoke Greek, not Egyptian. However, Cleopatra was known for embracing Egyptian customs and ruling as a pharaoh, which helped solidify her place in Egyptian history.